Hey, what's up, guys? It's your boy Sven, and we're back with the politics once again. Do you guys like that tagline? I think it's kind of cute. Anyways, let's get to something less cute. Today's video is probably going to be the most controversial video on this channel. So, try and bear with me, because it's gonna get a bit spicy. It may get a bit uncomfortable, but I think this is an important thing to talk about. So, as you can tell from the title, we're talking about lesser of two evils. So that's a concept us Americans are very familiar with. That's like how our politics works, actually. It's just lesser of two evils over and over and over again. But how about we apply that thinking to the current situation in Gaza? The lesser of two evils. Let's entertain it. Let's say, hypothetically, there was an election between Netanyahu and whoever the leader of Hamas is. Who would you be voting for? Because I genuinely think that I would be voting for Hamas. I know that sounds insane, but let's get into the comparison, shall we? Let's get into who is the lesser of the two evils here, and why one side is deemed terrorists while the other is deemed a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. First point is I'm going to compare their military actions. In terms of ideology, Hamas and Netanyahu's right-wing government are actually almost identical. Israel wants a full state of Jews and nothing else. A theocratic ethno-state. That is what he wants. What does Hamas want? They want to take over all of Israel and create their own theocratic ethno-state and kick out the Jews. What I'm saying is that what Hamas wants is essentially what Israel currently has and is doing. And yet we treat Hamas, correctly so, like the genocidal maniacs that they are. But then Israel gets a pass for just being a state, because it's recognized by the US. It's deemed a civilized state that gets to have a seat at the table. Whereas Hamas are just a bunch of thoughtless barbarians who just want to kill Jews. Now, I'm sure a lot of the rank and file members are that exact thing, but let's take October 7th, for example. That was a horrendous attack, obviously. 1,000 civilians died that day. And that is not something that you can say lightly. It truly was an atrocity committed by Hamas. I won't hold any water for them. But in terms of, I guess, the reasoning behind the attack, most outlets are getting it dead wrong. They're deemed as terrorists, so they're doing violence for the sake of violence. It's kind of the same thing with Osama bin Laden's letter to America. You know, amongst his religious fanaticism, there were legitimate criticisms of the United States. Of course, I don't support the methodology, but the reasoning is actually somewhat solid. And I would argue October 7th was arguably not as much of a collective punishment as 9/11 was. Because, let's look at the numbers. Half of the people Hamas killed were militants, and that's the fact. Even Israel acknowledges as such. Already, you know, this is showing that Hamas was at least attempting to target military bases, military fields, military personnel, and that their primary objective was a military capture of certain strategic locations. Of course, we've all been led to believe that their primary objective was to slaughter civilians left and right, and while that is what Hamas did, there's actually evidence to suggest that they did not primarily intend to do such a thing. Reason number one is that Hamas didn't know the music festival was going to be happening. At least that's what they claim. But the evidence also backs it up, because the music festival was supposed to end the day before October 7th, but the festival holders wanted to have an extra day for the festival, and they got it approved at the last second by the Israeli government. And so when Hamas showed up, there was all of a sudden all these people in the music festival, and of course, at that moment they were just like, fuck it, let's just kill everyone. But my point is, their attack had a purpose. It has strategy. I've only touched the surface of the strategy. And again, my point is that Hamas had objectives. They had geopolitical goals. They weren't just killing for the sake of killing. And I'm going to compare this to Israel's military response in the latter half of this video, so bear with me, because this probably will be uncomfortable to hear. What was Hamas's goal, you may be asking? Of course, the military capture is one thing, but a lot of people have been speculating that Hamas knew that Israel would fire back full force in a devastating display, as they're doing now. Essentially, they've fallen right into Hamas's hands, and they don't even know it. And this is where Hamas is truly vile, is because the loss of Palestinian lives is part of their calculus. They were intending for this to happen. This exact thing Hamas wanted. And they're getting what they wanted too. Palestinians have the most international recognition they've ever had, as a direct result of Israel's brutal bombardment, which was part of Hamas's plan, potentially. And so their plan was pure evil, because they are essentially condemning thousands of innocent civilians of their own people to death for the sake of a PR and political win. I mean, that is disgusting. But in a fucked up way, it's working? I don't really know how to feel about this specific point. I'm just trying to give you the reasoning behind why this happened and why this is happening. And this also doesn't excuse Israel. Saying that it's Hamas's trap is just pointing out how, idiotic and gleefully genocidal Israel is, that they fell for such an obvious ploy. Because what Hamas's real objective is in all of this is to end the negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia and Israel were currently, before this attack, they were in negotiations for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, and that would bring massive amounts of capital and massive amounts of power to Israel and to Saudi Arabia. Hamas knew that if this partnership went through, Israel would be near unstoppable. And the United States alliance in the Middle East would actually be successful and strong. Because for years now, the US has had Israel as an ally and Saudi Arabia as an ally who don't get along, and so that makes things very complicated. But if we could have them two working in lockstep alongside us, this axis would be unstoppable. And of course Hamas knew this, because this has been part of a trend that Trump started, that Biden continued, where, the United States negotiates with various Muslim countries to recognize the legitimacy of Israel. And so Hamas obviously doesn't want that to happen, because they hate Israel, and they don't want there to be an Israel. And again, in this regard, Hamas succeeded. Because of the war, and the brutal medieval-style siege, and the wanton casualties and atrocities and human rights violations, Saudi Arabia has ended the deal they were working out with Israel, and have instead decided to open up diplomatic relations with Iran, which would have been unthinkable before. And in fact, this helps the Iran axis of powers, including Hamas, tremendously by having relations with Saudi Arabia, who is the most powerful country in the Middle East, because they have the money. And so, again, this is not to condone Hamas's actions, but again, they succeeded in their goal, or at least what we can perceive their goals to have been. As for the Palestinians, they are not Hamas. I don't think they collaborate with Hamas. And I'm sure at this point, they do not support Hamas at all. Of course, they voted for them in 2006, That was very complicated, and it was such a long time ago at this point. Now, it may seem like I'm celebrating Hamas because I'm saying that they achieved their goals, but that is not the case. I'm trying to point out the reality that Hamas has succeeded in what they set out to do, in large part because of Israel's brutality. Because the Palestinians, they tried to get recognition and, potentially tried to stop normalization of relations with Israel in their own way, outside of Hamas, in 2018. And largely, they failed, because the world is a cruel place and doesn't care about them. So, what am I talking about? In 2018 to 2019, for the whole year, there was what is known as Gaza's Great March of Return, which was a peaceful protest movement where thousands of Palestinians would march up to the border, the southern border of Israel, and they would put up tents and protest. Did that work? This is a peaceful protest movement, mass mobilization. This is what you're supposed to do, right? Making their voices loud and clear. And so, international decorum and liberal thinking would prescribe that because their protests were so widespread, that they should get fair coverage from media sources around the world, and people around the world would hear their message and support them. But did that happen? No. Here's what actually happened. As the marches happened, every single Friday for a whole year, that is an insane protest movement, by the way. That is unprecedented. That is amazing. Beautiful, even. But what were they met with? What were they met with? Violence and hatred. And of course, this article goes to explain the reasons behind the protest, but I think we all know what the reasons are. That's not what this video is about. So, you had 266 wounded, 30,000 hospitalized, 400 people inhaling tear gas, which is a violation of international law. That is a war crime. I know that sounds a bit dramatic given that the police in the US use tear gas on our own citizens, but yes, that is a war crime. They shouldn't be doing that here or in Israel or in Gaza. And here's what I'm talking about. They had 7,731 people injured in the lower extremities. What this was that the IDF soldiers, perched on their little fucking tower, used sniper rifles to kneecap people. And that is intentionally destructive to someone's life. That will cripple them for life. And it's intentionally made to make them suffer as much as possible without killing them. There are many people who had to be amputated, 122 people who had to have their lower legs cut off because they got kneecapped. You had 665 medics wounded, 112 ambulances partially damaged, and 347 journalists wounded. And what was this in response to? Peaceful protests. A peaceful movement of people walking up to the southern border. That is just the worst. I mean, they weren't even protesting in a way that broke the law. You gotta understand, they were well within their right to stand there on their side of the border. They weren't approaching the border. They weren't trying to flood in. They were just chilling by the border. That would be like if a Mexican person walked up to the southern border and was just chilling there and saying, "Fuck you, Border Patrol. I don't like the US." And then they shot him. We don't do that here. And yet we let our allies wantonly do it with no consequences. But my whole point here is that this was the Palestinians' attempt at a peaceful solution. This was their attempt to get international recognition to their cause. And what were they met with? they were met with violence, but how did the West respond? Here I have a video that's a bit of a compilation of Western media in response to these protests. I don't know why it's sandwiched in this weird, like, Hassan fan video. I was just watching this because there was, like, a funny Trump bit. But, good journalism's good journalism, so I'll give it to him.
Symbolic action. To camp in tents and declare an open sit-in in the empty land right across the border, to draw attention to their struggle as refugees. That was the real threat to Israel, a political victory for the Palestinian cause. So they resorted to the go-to deflection.
Hamas is calling for more bloodshed today on the Israel-Gaza border. Thousands of Palestinians expected to riot.
To call this a protest is inaccurate. What actually happened is that
No, it actually is accurate. Thank you very much.
Hamas engineered an event where they wanted thousands of people to swarm into Israel.
They're paying them to get shot, believe it or not. They're paying them something like $500 per gunshot wound.
You know, Hamas sent a 7-year-old girl who was wearing a Minnie Mouse sweatsuit right up to the fence so that IDF troops would, in their perverse, in the perverse mindset of Hamas, would shoot her and kill her.
he almost let it slip too. Yeah, bro, Hamas sent these people to get shot for their own PR. And wait a minute, who was the one doing the shooting again? Who was the one in their perverse minds who thought that a 7-year-old girl was a threat? Oh, that's right, it was Hamas, of course, not the IDF. No. It was Hamas, throwing the children in front of the bullets that weren't fired by the IDF. I mean, how can you talk about them using human shields without acknowledging who is the one doing the shooting? Doesn't make any sense.
Reported that someone in a wheelchair was fatally shot, Mr. Ambassador.
Hamas is always very good at trying to put out all sorts of propaganda and myths. They're experts at that.
And they intentionally moved up the day so that it would coincide with the opening of the embassy move, so that we would all be disgusted and heartbroken when we saw this horrible split screen of Ivanka Trump looking like she was at a country club next to poor, desperate people dying in Gaza.
I agree with you. They planned that, absolutely.
Right, and I'm just saying, let's not fall for a trap that is being set by a theocratic, authoritarian group that is sending women and children.
I don't think I'm falling for a trap.
Shield.
I agree. I couldn't agree more with all of that.
I think it's...
I mean, these people don't realize how insane they sound. They wanted us to see on one side Ivanka Trump and on the other side people suffering in Gaza. But that's just propaganda. No, that's not what propaganda is. That's called showing reality. That is what actually was happening. That's just called real life. You can't take a video of a real life event and say, oh, that's propaganda because you don't like it. That's just...
terrible that Hamas is butchering its own children.
Anyways, I don't need to keep watching this shit, but the point is, when the Palestinians try to do something peaceful, and they get kneecapped for it in the thousands, it's treated as some sort of Hamas propaganda operation. When Israel snipes people and uses tear gas on them, there's some 3D chess where Hamas put the people in front of the tear gas so that we would feel bad for them. As if feeling bad for people getting tear gas is somehow wrong? And so, you suddenly start to wonder why October 7th happened. And why this mass amount of violence erupted. And it's because the Palestinians never had an option. Violence was the only option for them. Because it's either they roll over and take violence, or their most extreme elements commit violence of their own. And that's what happened. And even the violence that Hamas committed. Let's get to this story here. Again, I was saying earlier that it was mainly targeted at military stuff. But half of the people they killed were innocent civilians. But it's come out since October 7th that the IDF itself killed many of its own citizens on October 7th. And so I mean, look at the wreckage here of cars and buildings. And I want you to think, does Hamas have that kind of weaponry? Because I'm fairly certain that they don't, actually. Extensive damage done to these cars and homes was most likely done by Israeli tanks and missiles. And so, essentially, this is a very strongly worded article by the Liberation newspaper for Party of Socialism and Liberation. Oh, this is the PSL. Those guys are pretty cool, I guess. But based on eyewitness and military personnel accounts, Israel rolled in with the tanks and the Apache helicopters and indiscriminately fired into the crowd. Unable to tell if they were hitting civilians or militants or everyone in between. Let's get into some specifics here. Commander orders airstrikes on his own base. When the Erez crossing that was overrun by Hamas fighters, the base commander actually ordered an attack on his own base, even though the base was filled with Israeli civil administration officers and soldiers. Yeah, Israeli forces fired huge amounts of ordnance indiscriminately from tanks and US-supplied Apache helicopters on towns, as well as on cars that were fleeing the concert or cars that were driving towards Gaza with hostages, indiscriminately killing both Palestinian fighters and the Israeli civilians being held hostage. And so this is all kind of under the school of thought in the IDF called the Hannibal Directive, which I will get to in a little bit. But let's go more into this article. Military correspondent for Yonnet describes what the Air Force did. After the pilots realized that inside the army stations and settlements that were conquered by Palestinian fighters, we can't tell between terrorists and Israeli soldiers and civilians. And so the decision that was made was that the first objective of these helicopters is to stop the terrorists and the murderous masses from flowing into Israeli territory. 28 fighter helicopters shot all the ammunition they had, so hundreds of 30mm cannon mortars. The IDF helicopters also fired on terrorists and apparently hit some festival goers. Big surprise. They fired at multiple places on the fence to prevent Hamas from taking captives back, killing both the Hamas fighters and the Israelis. So, you gotta understand how unhinged that is. Killing the civilians so that they won't be taken hostage. I mean, so you don't actually care about them. You just don't want Hamas to have leverage, is what you're saying. It's not the safety of the people that's the first priority, it's not letting Hamas have something to negotiate with. Tanks fired, eliminating everyone, including hostages, undoubtedly, according to Yamin Porat, a Kibbutz Be'eri survivor. Tanks shell the homes of Israelis. The army admits to it, shelling the homes of Israelis who had been taken hostage. So they're being held hostage in their own home, and the army blows them up, because we can't let them get taken hostage. And the thing that first made all of this come to light was the fact that 200 immolated bodies were found out since October 7th to have been Hamas fighters, and not Israelis killed by Hamas. That's important because you're starting to wonder, wait, how did these Hamas fighters get burned so badly that they were unrecognizable? It's because of Israeli military, munitions, bombs, fire bombs, probably. I don't even know the full extent of what they got. Some kind of large explosive. And we've also found, that made people wonder, but what about all of these cars that have been completely blown up and charred? if the Hamas fighters were the ones who were burned up alive, doesn't that mean Israeli bombs were the ones that destroyed these cars, potentially holding many Israeli civilians? And it comes out to, yes, that is exactly what happened. And so this is all part of the Hannibal Directive, which is a deliberate protocol of the Israeli military, named after the Carthaginian general who took his life rather than be captured. The Israeli military authorizes massive firepower to prevent a captured Israeli soldier from being taken alive. So, let's say you're a sniper and you see one of your soldiers being held at gunpoint and dragged away. If you for some reason can't get a clear shot on the guy taking him hostage, you have full clearance to just shoot your own soldier. And so this is probably what they used on October 7th. But instead of for just soldiers, it probably applies as well to civilians. Let's see, on November 15th, in a Haaretz interview, Israeli Force Reserve Colonel Noferez spoke about the helicopters open firing on places along the border with Gaza. He explained that the Hannibal Directive was probably deployed because once you detect a hostage situation, this is Hannibal. So, he's not even apologetic, he's just saying, yeah, that's what we did. So that was a very lengthy section of the video, and again, it probably seems like I'm doing legwork for Hamas, but that is not the point. What is the point then? So, the point of all of this is for the sake of comparison. Comparison to Israel. Because the October 7th attack, which was the justification for all of what Israel has been doing in the last month, 2 months at this point, was 50% civilians killed by Hamas, that they might have not even known were there. And of the 50% of civilians who died, a chunk of them, an unknowable chunk of them, were killed by Israel's own military. So again, in the attack, you have a percentage of 50% of the killings that were civilians killed directly by Hamas. So their civilian casualty rate is maybe like 40%? 30% even? Still not good. But I am making a comparison. That is why this is called the lesser of two evils. Let's look at Israel now. And this section will be very short because we all know what they've been doing. I've been covering it very extensively. Israel has killed 20,000 Palestinians. And 90 to 80% of those are civilians. And that is independently verified by humanitarian organizations. That is not just me saying it. That is not just Hamas saying it. Or the quote-unquote Hamas-run health ministry. This has been verified extensively. So that's 80% civilians killed by Israel. And what are their goals? What are their objectives? They want to eliminate all of Hamas. That is not a realistic goal, even a little bit. That's completely untenable. First of all, Hamas's leadership isn't even in Gaza. They're chilling in Turkey and Qatar, doing negotiations right now, but probably sitting back, sipping on some fucking Turkish coffee and wine, and having a grand old time free from all of the violence. So you have the key leaders of the group who aren't even in the scope of the attack. And you can't distinguish between Hamas and Palestinians once you're on the ground because of urban warfare. And so, essentially, for Hamas, for you to take out all of Hamas without a chunk of them escaping, the only way to do that would be to literally kill every single person in the Gaza Strip. Or to displace them, I suppose, if you want to be merciful in your elimination of Hamas. Because there's no way to just get Hamas. It's literally impossible because of the human shields or whatever. They are mixed in, like the Viet Cong were. And so, is Israel really trying to get all of Hamas? Because even if they do get all of Hamas, all of the Hamas fighters, you are creating 3 times as many Hamas fighters. Because what are people gonna do after half their family has been murdered and they're still stuck in Gaza? What are their options? You either do nothing and die a miserable life of starvation and dehydration, or you take up arms and fight. So Israel is doing all of this for a completely untenable goal, with no real objectives. Except, of course, the one objective that people aren't actually talking about, which is to conquer all of Gaza. That's really what they want, right? And so you're looking at the two organizations, one with a 35% civilian casualty rate, one with an 80% civilian casualty rate, one with clear objectives for their violence that they succeeded upon, and even for taking hostages. The whole point was to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners, and they did get that done. They still have hostages to release, and it's not going as great as it could be, but think about this. Again, Hamas is achieving its objectives on all fronts. And when Israel takes prisoners from Palestinian lands, takes their own hostages, what is their goal? Are they seeking to do a trade? No, because I'm talking about the West Bank now. Israel has taken 2,000 Palestinians prisoner, with almost none of them being charged. And this was being done before October 7th, so they were obviously not taking these Palestinians hostage for some kind of exchange deal. So when Hamas takes people hostage, they have a goal to trade them. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying like it is. Telling it like it is. When Israel takes hostages, they torture them and lock them up for years with no actual goal in sight besides bigotry. When Israel slaughters thousands, they don't have a real goal besides a land grab. Whereas Hamas, well, their goal isn't exactly great, but it's at least more tenable. Recognition, ending diplomatic agreements between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so, I put forth the question to you. If you had an election between these two, who were you voting for? I know that's probably a stupid question, but why is it then that Hamas are terrorists and Israel is a beacon of democracy? I just wanted to put it all out onto the table, because I think Hamas has been largely misunderstood. And I'm not saying that they're good, or that their goals are reasonable, or that their end goals are justified in any way. But if you compare them to Israel, or if you compare them to, I don't know, the fucking United States military, or the military of Britain, or the military of Germany, or the military of our ally Saudi Arabia, even. God. They come out looking better than all of those militaries, and yet they're the terrorists. America isn't a terrorist state because we say so, right? So yeah, let me just reiterate. I hate both sides of this conflict. In terms of Israel versus Hamas, they're both deplorables, to use Hillary Clinton's words. But I just think it's important to know who the greater of two evils is. So, in the hypothetical Hamas-Israel election, I guess I'm voting Hamas, right? Yeah, this video got extremely rambly and might not make a lot of sense. I hope my point came across, and I hope I was very clear with my intentions. This was merely a comparison, just to put into perspective how monstrous Israel actually is. They are by and far worse than Hamas and Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China combined. Well, fuck it, Weeball, sure. They're worse than all of those terrible, terrible forces combined. And if you don't see that, then you're blind. That's been an extremely controversial video. This probably won't get promoted to anyone, because why would it, right? So if you liked what you saw, you can like, comment, and subscribe. For more, bye.